Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. Today on the program, we are going to be looking at John chapter 19. If you're just watching for the first time, then it's probably a good idea to go to our YouTube channel and find the playlist there that is called John's Gospel Series, and there you will find something like 22, 23 episodes previous to this one that will help you get up to speed. It's a great way to get a good idea of what's going on throughout John's Gospel and then be prepared for what we are about to study today, because the topic today is sort of the climax of the book. At the point where we pick up, Jesus has been arrested and he's been put through a trial, I guess you could call it. And we actually pick up just before chapter 19 begins, in the middle of chapter 18, verse 38, because that was the most natural break and that's where we left off last time. It's appropriate that we're picking up in the middle of a verse because we're also picking up in the middle of a very quick sequence of events. A lot has happened in chapter 18. Jesus was arrested, he was abandoned, he was hauled to the high priest's father-in-law's house, and then he was hauled to the actual high priest, and then he was hauled over to Pilate, who seemed a bit distracted, but he can at least tell that Jesus isn't a criminal, and that's where we find ourselves in the middle of verse 38. After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So Pilate is clearly trying to dismiss this whole thing. He wants to get rid of it. He doesn't see any reason to execute Jesus. And as he takes it to the crowd that's gathered outside his headquarters, they are just not having it. It's kind of a misguided attempt anyway. See, Pilate knows that the people generally like Jesus, and so he assumes that the religious authorities who have accused him represent just a vocal minority. And he figures that if he appeals to the crowd, they're probably going to say, "We want Jesus back. We don't want him killed." And he would rather do that than embarrass the religious leaders and just completely ignore the real reason for releasing Jesus, which would be the fact that he's innocent. Instead, he's kind of trying to dress it up as if releasing Jesus would be releasing a justly imprisoned person, because that's the custom. And so verse 40 is a bit of a surprise. They say, "No, we don't want him. We want Barabbas." Oops. Pilate had meant to encourage the crowd in the other direction, and that sort of backfired. He's trying to stabilize the situation. He's playing politics, and he's trying to shore up his position and avoid upsetting either the religious authorities or the crowd. He would rather the fight be between the religious authorities and the crowd, and instead he's kind of signed himself up to release an actual insurrectionist and murderer. Bad move. From there, let's pick up with the first 5 verses of chapter 19. "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, 'See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him.' So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, 'Behold, the man.'" Pilate knows this whole thing is unnecessary. He just wants the whole thing to go away if he could possibly manage it. And he's still kind of worried that the crowd outside his headquarters isn't representative of the whole populace. So he's worried about the damage that's going to be done with his relationship to the religious authorities if he just bulldozes them. And he's also worried about his relationship to the crowd if he goes along with the religious authorities. Further, he's worried about Rome's position there in Judea. They are an occupying force. They're not very well liked. He's kind of trying to come up with a compromise. He figures, well, if I have this poor guy just beaten horribly, then maybe that'll satisfy the people who want him dead, but it won't anger the people who don't want him dead. The soldiers treat Jesus very, very badly here, obviously. That's kind of their job. They're supposed to. Not only are they beating him, but they're kind of adding insult to injury. They're mocking him on several levels. When they put a purple robe on him, that's the color of royalty. It was a very expensive dye at that time. So they're putting him in royal clothing. They're putting a crown of sorts on his head, but it's a crown of thorns. They are hailing him as King of the Jews in verse 3, with basically the same language that would be used to hail the emperor. So there's a psychological element to the torture they're inflicting, but of course the more important aspect is the physical torture. They're using a whip that is woven with little bits of glass and rock and sometimes metal in the tails. And it would just absolutely tear into the flesh of this person's back. Often it would get to the point where you could see the actual muscles. Sometimes you could actually see the bone. And then we have verse 5, this behold the man. This is a scene that is very well represented in art over the years. Here are a few examples of the ways that Jesus is depicted, and these artworks are all labeled something like ecce homo, which is the Latin phrase, behold the man, as we read in verse 5. It used to stupefy me that such an emphasis was placed on this relatively minor scene. But over the years I've come to understand it better and come to understand why it has been so emphasized. Turn back to Zechariah chapter 6. Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold the man whose name is the branch. For he shall branch out from his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. It is he who shall build the temple of the Lord, and shall bear royal honor, and shall sit and rule on his throne. And there shall be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace shall be between them both. Branch is referring to the Messiah. We've got him sitting on the throne as king, and then we're also told a priest sits on that throne at the same time. A priest and a king, well, that's Jesus. And the whole thing was introduced with the phrase, behold the man whose name is the branch. It's the same phrase that Pilate has uttered here, behold the man. Now, of course, it's purely accidental. Pilate has no clue. He doesn't know the scriptures. He doesn't think that he is referring to Jesus as the Messiah here. But it does go to show the providence of God, where these prophecies are being fulfilled in ways that wouldn't have even been expected. So what's Pilate trying to accomplish here? What's his angle? Why does he bother to bring Jesus out? Why does he present him in front of the crowd and say, behold the man, as if it's some auspicious occasion, when it's really just, another poor guy who's been flogged? That was not exactly a rarity. Well, from the context and everything that we know of Pilate, it's not that he's playing to the audience. It's not that he's saying, here's the guy who has caused such a fuss. He's really still trying to get them to relent. He's trying to get them to leave Jesus alone and allow him to release him. Here Jesus is, battered and pathetic, dressed in purple with a crown of thorns on his head, I'm sure blood pouring down his face, his back in tatters, his face bruised because he's been not only flogged with a whip, but he's been beaten. He's a spectacle. And to look at him, you would think, surely this guy is not a threat. If you were one of those religious authorities, at least in Pilate's mind, you might then be thinking, surely after appearing like this, none of these people are going to want to follow him. The guy who looks so horrible, the guy who's so maimed. And surely after going through this, he'll learn his lesson and he won't cross us again. Surely this means the problem is solved, and maybe we can just let it go at that. That's what Pilate is hoping for. Is that what's going to happen? Verse 6. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Well, it looks like Pilate's plan isn't working out. Funnily enough, these religious authorities, they keep adding more details to the situation to try to get Pilate to crucify the guy, and every detail they add makes it harder for Pilate to make that decision. Now he's been told this guy is claiming to be the Son of God. That scares Pilate. He doesn't take it as a given that Jesus is completely wrong about this claim. He thinks, hang on, I'm not sure that I want to be involved with this. In verse 10, when he's clearly upset at Jesus and says, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" He's not belligerently talking down to Jesus. He's almost begging for help. But Jesus has gone silent. He talked and talked and talked for several chapters, all of chapter 13, all of chapter 14 and 15 and 16, and all of 17. It's only here in chapters 18 and 19 that he's clammed up. The man who became so famous for his teaching now is refusing to speak, even when it seems like it would be beneficial for him to do so. It's not completely clear why he is silent at this time. Is he being careful not to say something that would mess up the whole course of events? Is he just trying to let events take their course? Is he just giving up? Is he trying to hold back from saying something that, from a moral perspective, he shouldn't? As we think about that, let's keep reading. Verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Finally, the religious authorities have found the ticket: politics. They could have started here, but they didn't. They did sort of imply in the charge that they passed on to Pilate from the get-go, but it wasn't really front and center. Let's go back and look at that in chapter 18, verse 29. So Pilate went outside and said to them, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." There they're just evading the question, but eventually when pressed, they do tell him something. Because verse 33 says, "So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?'" Well, where did he get that idea? Obviously the authorities gave that idea to him. So they kind of started there. He says he's the king of the Jews, but they haven't made it explicit yet that they're going to paint this as a rebellion against Rome. Pilate wasn't really concerned about Jesus before. He didn't really take it all that seriously. So why does he take it seriously now? Well, because now they're threatening Pilate. This is the most effective kind of threat, where they haven't actually said their threat out loud, but they're making the implication very clear. What they're trying to get across to him without saying so is that we will spread it about that you stand opposed to Caesar. And this report will make its way to Rome. And you don't want that, do you? Well, clearly he doesn't want that to happen. Now he feels forced to sit in judgment. A fair amount of time has passed since Jesus was delivered over to him. It's not as if Pilate's handling this flippantly. He does care. And yet, it is still a little bit rushed, all things considered. It's clearly not about establishing his true guilt or innocence. This is a purely political, transactional procedure in which the verdict has nothing to do with the truth, which is perhaps not a surprise, since the very man who sits in judgment said back in chapter 18, verse 38, "What is truth?" This is about ends and means, no more. Pilate makes one more pitiful appeal to the crowd. "Shall I crucify your king?" That crowd has probably been increasing throughout the whole ordeal, and so he's hoping, A, they'll shout it down and he'll be out of this pickle, or B, failing that no one can later blame him as a religious persecutor, because he can say, well, the crowd prevailed upon me. They insisted. Pilate wants to come off as a just and sympathetic ruler here, but instead he comes off as a spineless toady. This is at odds of the impression that we would have of Pilate as a brutal tyrant, including other references to him in the Gospels. For example, in Luke chapter 13, the first several verses of the chapter, we read about the blood that Pilate mixed with some people's offerings. There's also an incident of some Roman standards that he brought right into Jerusalem and right up to the Temple Mount and caused a bit of a ruckus. There was another incident where he, in order to put down a riot, had members of his guard enter into the crowd in disguise and then on a signal just beat the ever-loving. That riot incidentally occurred when Pilate decided to use the temple treasury funds to pay for a new aqueduct. And the people were not too thrilled about God's money being used that way for perhaps obvious reasons. There's also later on, after the Gospels are over, the slaughter of Samaritans in a goofy religious cult, and that's actually what led up to Pilate's deposition as the ruler in Judea. All of those you can find in the accounts of Josephus, by the way. But you know, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not necessarily that Pilate was either a harsh, brutal, ruthless tyrant or a spineless, wimpy little worm. Most likely, we are seeing a man who lacks discipline, a man who lacks self-control. He's not willing to stand up and take the heat for his decisions, and he's not even willing to make decisions if he thinks that they are too risky. And when he thinks that he is losing control, he lashes out in anger or in desperation or perhaps in both, with very little regard for justice. He's a very sad character, and he's not the worst or the most obvious villain in the story at this point, but he's definitely not someone that we should emulate either. He has no grounding. He has no principles. He's an empty suit. Let's keep reading in the middle of verse 16. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the Place of a Skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather, This man said, I am King of the Jews. Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. So after all Jesus has been through, they lay the very implement of his death on his back and make him carry it to the place of his execution. That sounds excessively brutal, and perhaps it is, but it's worth noting that it was standard practice for the Romans. Often an inscription was attached to the cross of a dying victim, a label that let passers-by know what crime this guy had committed in order to go and get himself executed. The point was to serve as a deterrent, which is pretty much why the Romans picked crucifixion in the first place. It's cheaper and quicker to execute someone in any number of more directly violent methods, but pinning them up to a cross by a busy road where anyone passing by could see him suffering in agony and then see his body decompose over the next couple weeks, well, would it make you more or less likely to engage in the sorts of activity that led to such an end, were you to see such a poor guy hanging on a cross? So often they labeled them, when it was convenient to do so at least, as a way of letting people know specifically what sorts of crimes they might want to avoid committing. In Jesus' case, the crime was, what? The King of the Jews. The chief priests want to make it more clear. The crime, they contend, was saying he was the King of the Jews. Pilate, while he doesn't take Jesus all that seriously, as we've seen, leaves out the action and just makes it a label, the King of the Jews. This is a subtle dig at the Pharisees who have badgered him into having Jesus killed. Passers-by aren't expected to take the label seriously either. After all, some king he is, some Messiah, given that he's pinned up there on a cross. This is the old, he saved others, he cannot save himself shtick. But Pilate's choice of words here hints to the common people whose support Pilate wants more than that of the religious leaders. It hints to them that their supposed betters persecuted this harmless do-gooder, as Pilate thinks of him, out of envy and concern, in order to maintain their own position of authority. Pilate is playing politics, and he figures that keeping the common people at odds with their fellow Jews, who wielded some power, was a good way to keep them from uniting against him and making his position less secure. Pilate, who is willing to be pushed around in some pretty big ways, finally decides he's digging in on this one. This is like when your child scowls at you while doing exactly as they were told. You can make me do it, but you can't make me like it. Verse 23. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. John is stressing here the fulfillment of prophecy, and the other gospel writers make many similar points, especially with regard to this very scene. And what's he thinking about? I want to make sure my mom is taken care of. Solid. Jesus wants John to take care of his mother from now on, and John, who is dutifully standing nearby watching Jesus slowly die on the cross, obeys without a word. Verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill the scripture, "I thirst." A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And another scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. They won't even give a sip of water to a dying man. Here, have some vinegar, buddy. Well, in any case, that seems to help him a little bit, and just before dying, when you would expect him to be at his absolute lowest, when it looks like most everything he has promised was a lie, and when it looks like the whole thing is unraveling before the eyes of the people who believed in him the most, he claims victory. It is finished. He doesn't mean, I give up, I'm done fighting, or anything like that. He means, it is accomplished. I did what I set out to do. And finally, he bows his head and relinquishes his life. You would think that would be the point to emphasize, but John disagrees. He devotes a few sentences to Jesus' death, and then launches into perhaps the oddest section of his entire gospel, in which he's oddly adamant about some things that we probably didn't realize were the subject of any dispute. John himself is pointing out that this was not normal. It took place because it was prophesied that his bones wouldn't be broken. Ordinarily, that would have been the method of hastening along this poor man's death. Normally, he would not have been pierced at all, but it was prophesied that he would be. It was prophesied that his bones would not be broken. We're only just scratching the surface here, but we've got to move on. Verse 38. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes about 75 pounds in weight. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Now Mark and Luke tell us that Joseph was a member of the council, the Sanhedrin, the very same body that had condemned Jesus and brought him to Pilate. Here's another in a long line of examples of people who believed in Jesus and supported him, but not publicly. He and Nicodemus seem to get over it by this point. Mark tells us that Joseph had to take courage in order to approach Pilate and request the body. Same goes for Nicodemus, by the way, whom we saw back in chapter 3, and who had a brief appearance in chapter 7 as well, trying to slow down the increasingly hateful and murderous council. The end of chapter 19 is almost boring in comparison with everything that has happened in the first 37 verses, but it's laying out details that will be important very soon. Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, but it wasn't tossed in a pauper's grave as you might have expected. Instead, two rich guys gained custody of the corpse and determined to treat it with dignity and respect. The Sabbath is going to lock everything down in just an hour or two, so they hurriedly wrap the body up and place it in the nearest accessible tomb, which actually belongs to Joseph, according to Matthew 27, verse 60. And then they all wait. Everyone has the rest of Friday and all of Saturday to remember and reflect upon what has just happened. Some feel that the nightmare is over. Some are just glad the whole fiasco is behind them and didn't cost them any more pain and suffering on their own part. Some are confused, disappointed, devastated. Some are consumed with their own guilt. And some have an inkling of hope, although it's tiny and clamped down tightly by everything they observe happening around them. The Sabbath was intended as a day of rest to be spent with family and with God, learning more about Him and rededicating themselves to His worship and service and law, and to enjoying the glimpses that they're afforded of living in His presence. But on this Sabbath, they have instead cast God out of their presence, or at least lost His physical presence. And we read almost nothing about that day. We already know what's coming. John knows that we know that, and he's not trying to surprise us. But he has written this in such a way as to emphasize the lack of life. There's no dialogue, no quotations, instead just a sterile report of the consequences of the dialogue that has happened off stage. The Jews asked Pilate something, Joseph asked Pilate something else, and Joseph and Nicodemus wordlessly set about their depressing task. This book is driven by dialogue, so it really stands out as an eerily silent period, and it coincides with the last thing that Jesus said all the way back in verse 30. It is finished. Well, this part of the story is. The toughest part is past, but the most important part is still coming next time in chapter 20. I hope you'll join me then, but in the meantime, I hope that you will spend the rest of today as Jesus' disciples surely spent that Sabbath, contemplating Jesus' death and your part in it, and what it all means, especially in the absence of a resurrection. If you have questions about this or need help with other spiritual struggles, then feel free to reach out to us at River Ridge. We'd be happy to help you. You can reach us by phone at 812-550-6234 or by email at info@riverridgechurch.org or on our Facebook page, or you can visit us in person at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, Indiana for our 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Sunday worship and 7 p.m. Wednesday Bible study. We hope to see you there, but in the meantime, thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.